Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cameron Concerini. I'm the policy director for NUFTI, the National Union for Democracy in Iran. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all this morning. And I'm going to kick it off to Dr. Saeed Ganji, the president and chairman of NUFTI, to begin this afternoon session. Dr. Ganji, the floor is yours.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Cameron. Welcome everyone for joining us from across the United States and beyond. As you do know, NUFTI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization of Iranian American based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to supporting the cause of human rights, freedom, and democracy in Iran. In Washington, of course, there is never a dull moment as we concentrate to promote human rights, rule of law, and a democratic form of government in Iran. Now, Afghanistan is falling apart. Although every country is different, but I am not comparing the two countries. But the Afghans are going through the same situation under Biden administration that Iranians went through under Carter administration about 43 years ago. After a few decades now we know that people are against the revolution and they simply regret what happened 43 years ago. What happened to Kabul is basically a tragedy, is basically very disheartening. But a few years from now, we'll probably find out as to what type of deals were made in Kabul, before that country fell. What deals, what arrangements were made, and how did U.S. forego thousands of precious lives, trillions of dollars, and exit Afghanistan with the absolute embarrassment. Getting back to Iran, the abuse of human rights and people's struggle for freedom, we thought to put together a panel of experts and activists from inside Iran to discuss a topic called Cry from Iran, How America Can Help. I shall note that I still strongly believe that people of Iran have to be the agent of change. Our first panelist is Victoria Coates, who has a PhD in art history. Dr. Coates is an academic and policymaker with senior experience across the U.S. government, including the Congress, White House, Department of Energy, and the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Formerly serving as a Deputy National Security Advisor, Dr. Coates balances national security urgencies against economic viabilities in order to advance American interests and prosperity, and has a wealth of experience on the Iran file. Our second panelist is Lisa Daftari, who is an Iranian-American investigative journalist focusing on foreign affairs with a specialization in Middle Eastern policy and counterterrorism. Ms. Daftari regularly appears on TV and radio with commentary and analysis, providing exclusive reporting on vital development in the region. She serves as a founder and editor-in-chief of the Foreign Desk, an international news and U.S. foreign policy news website. Our next panelist was Mr. Jawad Lal Mohammadi, who was a signatory of a famous 14-person declaration by leading dissidents in Iran, which called on a resignation of Ali Khamenei and the end to the Islamic Republic. Unfortunately, we just learned from the Hernan news agency that he was summoned to appear before the revolutionary court in Isfahan and will not be able to attend. I would like to welcome both of our distinguished panelists and thank them in advance for their time, insight, and contribution to our cause. Now I pass over the mic to Cameron. Thank you, Cameron.
Dr. Ganji, thank you very much, and thank you for your tireless leadership of NUFTI and all the work that you've done. Ladies and gentlemen, as Dr. Ganji mentioned, Mr. Lal Mohammadi will not be able to join us today for reasons outside of our control. As he mentioned, it was reported by Harana, a leading human rights news outlet, that Mr. Lal Mohammadi was summoned before the Islamic Republic's courts. This is not the first time that this will have been the case. Mr. Mohammadi has been arrested several times for his activism, although we are not able to confirm whether he has in fact been arrested this time or not. We extend our prayers and our best wishes both to him, to his family, and all other activists who bravely fight for freedom and democracy in Iran. So again, I just say that we can't confirm whether he has indeed been arrested or not, but we've been unable to contact him, regrettably, and he has been summoned before the Revolutionary Court. We hope to have the pleasure of hosting him and many more voices from inside Iran in the near future. In lieu of Mr. Lal Mohammadi himself speaking to you today, we're going to play a short clip, which is his last video statement that he put out several weeks ago after he was released from his most recent imprisonment, and of course, that
جناب آقای خامنه‌ای، حواستون به خودتون باشه، مواظب باشید، اون روزها نزدیکه، زمانی که صدام رو از دخمه ها کشیدن بیرون. اگر آمریکایی ها کشیدن، مردم شما رو از دخمه ها خواهند کشید. روزگاری باشی که مثل قذافی التماس کنید، بگید شما فرزندان من هستید و هر تکه گوشتتون دست یک نفر باشه. جناب آقای استاندار خراسان، گورت رو گم کن، از خراسان برو. آقای رئیس اطلاعات خراسان که تازیانه میزنی به پشت یک معلم، گورت رو گم کن برو، برید از این مملکت. جناب آقای رئیس آموزش پرورش، به اندازه کافی دزدی گرگی کردید، به اندازه کافی سر معلمان رو کلاه گذاشتید، بس دیگه برید. جناب آقای رئیسی، برو بغل سید حسن نصرالله، بغل حوثی‌های یمن، برو بغل دوستان خودت، بس کنید. مردم شما رو نمیخوان، گورتون رو از این مملکت گم کنید. روزگار قذافی به سر شما خواهد آمد، روزگار صدام به سر شما خواهد آمد. آقای خامنه‌ای، از این مملکت برو. مردم از تو خسته شدن، مردم از شما خسته شدن، از بس گند و کثافت زدید بر این مملکت. مردم شریف ایران، بنده 8 روزه در بندهای اینها هستم. 8 روزه بر بدن یک معلم تازیانه میزنم. بدن من تاول زد، اما به کوری چشم اینها لحظه آخ نگفتم. حسرت یک آخ رو بر دل اینها گذاشتم. هر ضربه تازیانه‌ای که بر پشت من زدن، گفتم نه به جمهوری اسلامی. تنها راه درست شدن مملکت، گم شدن اینها از این مملکت، آزادی این مملکت. اگر میخواهید کاری انجام بدید، دست به دست هم بدید، زنجیره انسانی درست کنید. اینها در مقابل شما عاجز هستند، اینها هیچ کاری نمیتونن انجام بدن. نهایتش این است که دستهای من رو بشکنن، نهایتش این است که هر بلایی که بتونن به سر من بیارن، نهایتش این است که گوشت و پوست و استخوان من همه به هم بچسبه، اما ریزه کوتاه نخواهم آمد.
That, as we mentioned, was Mr. Lal Mohammadi's last video statement put out about 3 weeks ago after his most recent arrest and, as you saw, torture that he faced at the hands of the Islamic Republic. And unfortunately, as we mentioned, for those just joining us, Mr. Lal Mohammadi has been summoned to the Revolutionary Court in Isfahan, and we're unaware of his current status and therefore regret that he's unable to join us today. Lisa, Victoria, thank you so much for joining us. As Dr. Ganji said, you both are leading experts on the Iran file in different ways, but have been working on it for so long, and we appreciate your flexibility in today's event. It's a pleasure to host you again, Victoria, and Lisa, a pleasure to have you on a Nufti event for the first time. Lisa, I'll start with you. As a journalist at the Foreign Desk, now as the editor, and previously you've worked at leading international media outlets and leading American media outlets. Why do you think it is that, unfortunately, too often what is referred to as the mainstream media, tends to ignore the voices of dissidents from inside Iran, who, as you just saw in that video, and I know that you have a long history of being in touch with Iranians inside the country and interviewing dissidents, activists, they show such immense bravery, and they're willing to come on events like our own, which risk their lives. Why is it that they aren't given the same platform, or oftentimes given any platform at all in the international media?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, when you watch this man and his just his emotional state and what he's endured, you know, the translation doesn't do it justice, and I'm sure for those who don't speak Farsi, you can just hear it in his voice, what he has endured. And there's so many Iranians and others all over the world that are enduring the same kind of pain at the hands of their governments, and asking for us to tell their stories. From the perspective of a journalist, I would say that it fluctuates. You know, the appetite of the mainstream media audience. In a macro sense, they don't have the same appetite for foreign news as they do for domestic news, and you know, more recently that's very much justified, right? So why are we looking up the streets of Raqqa, Syria, when we should be looking up the streets of Oregon and wondering what the heck's going on in our country? At a time where you are looking at these hotspots in the world, the way we're looking at Afghanistan right now, then the politics mix in, and you know, we are put in an awful position as journalists over the last 2 decades or so, even more so. But I think we've become much more aware of the mainstream media because of more independent outlets, and because, you know, of citizen journalism, because the people of Iran, for example, came out to Twitter in the 2009 Green Revolution. We dawned at the Twitter revolution because we no longer had to wait for a mainstream media piece from the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post to tell us what's going on the streets of Iran. We had people telling us firsthand. So, you know, that's a very, very, you know, positive aspect of the changes that we're experiencing. But for the last 2 decades or so, it's whatever's coming out of the White House that trickles down into what we have control over and what appetite the audience has for this kind of news. So, you know, a lot of times I'm called an activist and not a journalist. Why? Because before I even begin to tell you what the people of Iran are enduring, I have to tell you why the Iran nuclear deal is not a good idea, why making nice with this regime is not a good idea, why you can never call this regime moderate, or you can never hope for it to be reformed. And because of the work that we have to do as journalists in establishing these what should be, you know, nonpartisan talking points to say that this is actually a brutal regime. And here's the evidence. The people of Iran are telling you this man's video is evidence, and that's what we should be listening to, not what's coming out at the White House. And that should be, you know, evergreen. That should be the position of what used to be, you know, foreign policy, you know, human rights, you know, having Israel as an ally, all of the things that we were accustomed to taking for granted coming out of Washington, regardless of who the president was, are now really at the mercy of what they're feeling, what they're putting out. And right now, to go back to your initial question, the White House, before this Afghanistan fiasco, was their main foreign policy goal was to push through an Iran nuclear deal, regardless of the facts on the ground. And to do that, they needed to ignore the cries of the Iranian people. They needed to ignore these inconvenient truths, these sad, sad truths of the people, the women, the children, the journalists, people being killed for a mere Facebook post or conveying their you know, political persuasion at a peaceful protest. We've seen so many of these individuals, a wrestler, you know, Neda. There's so many iconic faces, and there's so many faces that are not talked about or written about. So that's unfortunately the cycle that we deal with as journalists. We try to put them, you know, put these stories out as much as possible. I'll tell you from my perspective, and during my career at the beginning, I started covering the people of Iran when I was in 8th grade, and I say that because I started doing a term paper, and because of that, I got, you know, so into connecting with individuals on the ground in Iran, telling their story, and you know, it's become much more, you know, easy for us because as people have become much more courageous, like this man who puts this video out right after being, you know, arrested and detained, he puts out another video. So the people of Iran have become increasingly courageous. And for us, that means we have no excuses but to continue telling their stories.
Thank you, Lisa. Victoria, Lisa talks about the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. As Dr. Ganji mentioned in the introduction, you have been worked across several areas of the government, in executive departments, in the Congress, in the NSC, as deputy and national security advisor. Can you give us a bit of inside baseball, if you will, on the decision-making process? I know you obviously can't discuss everything, but when you were on the NSC, when you were part of the team making decisions about U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran specifically, were you seeing these images in the previous administration? Were you all seeing the demonstrations, as Lisa called them, the cries from inside Iran, the videos like Mr. Lal Mohammadi's video that we just saw, and how did that impact your thinking, and how did that play into the process? And then, as a corollary to that, do you think the Biden administration is seeing these images, and are they choosing to ignore them? Are they not getting to them? What's the difference between what was happening in the previous administration and what we're seeing today?
Well, thank you, Cameron, and thank you, Dr. Ganji and Lisa, for all participating in this important event. Obviously, our prayers are with Mr. Mohammadi and his family. Really an extraordinary video, which I think captured what the sense from inside Iran of what is so terribly wrong with this regime in terms of their just blatant, I would say, criminal neglect of the domestic crises that are facing the Iranian people, from the pandemic to education, as he's a teacher, to the environment, labor, all of these things. And then the focus of resources on the state sponsorship of terror from Yemen to Lebanon. And I think that is an extraordinary message. To your question, yes, we did hear and prioritize the voices of dissidents out of Iran. We had a series of quite dramatic protests that broke out across the country during President Trump's tenure, and that was something that we all tried very hard to support and to amplify. And one key thing as we get into what we can do to actually help is just this week, Representative Salazar from Florida announced the American Freedom and Internet Access Act, the new bill that she has introduced in the House. And she is particularly interested in the Cuba issue and the recent crackdown on internet freedom from Cuba. But obviously, as her press release says, this has broad applicability to Iran and North Korea and other locations as well as Cuba. And I think this is a place where the Congress can play a really vital role, championing our new ability to implement satellite-provided internet access to oppressed populations whose regimes are trying to cut off that access. And I was very struck by what Mr. Mohammadi said about forming a human chain to resist the regime. I wonder if we could form a digital chain to resist them. And obviously it's more than just beaming in internet access. It's a complicated project, but it's one we can definitely get after. So I'm encouraged by that. As to the current administration's views, I think unfortunately they have shown an inclination to what they might call compartmentalize these issues. And one thing I was just discussing in an earlier meeting today is the corollary between their removal of the Houthi from the foreign terrorist organization list and their refusal to call the Taliban a foreign terrorist organization, and to even to label the Taliban as enemies of America. And as the National Security Advisor refused to call them enemies, the Taliban were parading mock coffins covered with American flags around Kabul. I mean, it's kind of a disconnect there. And my fear is that, as Lisa said, they're so eager to get back into some version of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal, that they just will ignore this. It's an inconvenient truth for them that there are brave souls inside of Iran who will risk their physical safety to call out the regime for its crimes. but we, those of us on the outside, can still do everything we can to try to amplify those voices.
Thank you so much. And Lisa, you mentioned citizen journalists. Obviously, you, I mean, I'm sure everyone in this room and those who watch it later who watch Iran are familiar with the excellent work that you do and the way that you highlight dissident voices. And there are other excellent reporters. Just this week, there was a great piece that I recommend everyone read in the Dispatch about the people of Iran and just how opposed the vast majority of Iranians are to this regime, as you saw exhibited in Mr. Mohammadi's video. But these still don't reach, for example, the main papers or the main news programs that are beamed to millions of Americans and just become the de facto or default truth that they assume is the case. And of course, the problem with the mainstream media is not relegated only to the issue of Iran. We see it on loads of other issues, and we can certainly discuss those on other days. But from a media perspective, we see this. From a policy perspective, we see this, and I'll ask Victoria about this in a second. But why is it, at least it appears to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, why is it that Iran is treated differently than even other countries? And even this administration, for example, Victoria mentioned Cuba. You have the DHS secretary saying that our policy towards Cuba is going to be driven by the Cuban American community. We're going to hold this, criminal Castro regime accountable. They've never said anything to that extent about the regime in Iran. And I would argue that the Islamic Republic is much more vicious and violent and criminal and a threat to the United States than the Cuban regime is. So why is Iran, why is the Islamic Republic treated so differently across all these areas, the media, policy, et cetera? In your view, as someone who's covered this issue for so long, and as someone obviously to whom the issue of Iran is quite close to your heart?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, if you're talking about the current administration, I think it's its own beast. They pick and choose, foreign policy crises and human rights crises that fits their perspective and their political agenda. And, that could be said for any administration. But when, you have in the Trump administration, they lead with a pressure campaign, that doesn't give me any, that doesn't give off the impression that they're after normalizing a government that is brutal or terroristic in its nature. It gives me the impression that they want to put pressure on that government to see some sort of behavioral change, particularly with regard to its, investments in terrorism globally, and as well as its human rights abuses back at home. But I think it's seasonal. Look, I don't know if there's anything in particular against Iran or the Iranian people. With regards to my audiences, they're always eager to hear about the Iranian people, whether it's a good story, a happy story or not. They're interested in knowing what these people are going through. I think 2009 was very much eye-opening when people saw the footage of people coming out of Iran. They're like, wow, they don't ride on donkeys and they're not all, religious zealots. Wow, they have lovely hair and they're beautiful women. And okay, maybe we should learn more about this. I think there's a lack of education coming up from school children up into the mainstream media. So I think the more we do to educate people on the realities of the people of Cuba, of the people in Afghanistan, of the people in Iran, it will break through these trends and break through whatever's going on in Washington. We rely on the mainstream media as much as the jig is up and everyone's like, wow, we're skeptical of the mainstream media. That's what everyone relies on for their education or their awareness of these major global issues. So with regards to Iran, it's seasonal. When you have the protests, you have some coverage. As of late, we don't have any coverage. Again, going back to what's coming out of the White House. Look at let's just juxtapose this with what's going on in Afghanistan. These are rich stories coming out of Afghanistan, that women can no longer go to university. Imagine you're getting your PhD and you might be in your last semester, but you can't go to university anymore, or you've become a lawyer or a judge or a doctor and you can no longer go to work anymore. These stories aren't being told either. And that's, again, because our administration is trying to paint a very different picture, that the Taliban is not as bad as we think, that we're aiming for diplomacy with the Taliban. And I will quote Secretary of State Blinken, who came out 2 days ago and said, we want the Taliban to earn global legitimacy and support. That's coming out of our government, that they are advocating for the Taliban to become normalized. So of course, we're not going to see those stories that really do away with that narrative or question that narrative. And the same thing goes for the people of Iran. But again, this is why we're very thankful for groups like Nafti and independent journalists and other think tanks and groups that will put out this information, as well as citizen journalists who will use their platforms and risk their lives to get the truth out.
Thank you, Lisa. And of course, as we mentioned, one of those excellent journalists is you. And I know people so appreciate the coverage that you provide. And an excellent public servant has been you, Victoria, across multiple administrations. And I know that the people in oppressed countries are people that you have often defended, and the cause of whom you have diligently promoted, and even now being outside of government service, you continue to do so. And so we're also extremely thankful for you and all that you've done. You mentioned internet access, and this is something that you've written about extensively. Why do you, this seems like such a no-brainer. I know that in the previous administration, you all were working on this, and perhaps had there been more time, we could have seen more. But I mean, we're not talking about some broad intervention. We're not talking about, I think often those of us who promote human rights and democracy abroad are cast as warmongers, and especially in light of what's happening in Afghanistan, the nation building idea is over. But providing internet access is not war. Providing internet access is not nation building. Why is there seemingly so much reticence from the current administration, or unfortunately, the Democratic Party, it seems, I'd love to be proven wrong, to provide these most basic things: access to information, access to communication, to people in oppressed countries all over, obviously, particularly Iran, but Cuba, as you mentioned, China, North Korea. Why isn't this a bipartisan issue?
Well, my hope is, Cameron, that it will become a bipartisan issue because, as you say, freedom of information, that's our brand, freedom of speech. That's what we do as Americans. And I think given what we've seen from the People's Republic of China, who basically their brand, their export is oppression. They have helped the Iranian regime implement one of the most brutal sort of architectures of repression and silencing of voices. And so I think, part of this is technology. After Hurricanes Harvey and Maria in 2017, we developed the capacity to start to deploy these satellite systems. And I'm sure people have seen, SpaceX, for example, is starting to launch thousands of satellites that will provide this service. So we've had an evolving technology that's now, much more off the shelf than it would have been 5-6 years ago. And we have this capacity. And so it is very much my hope that we will have partners across the aisle who will just see this as a good idea. This is a good tool for the United States to have. Heck, it would be great to have it here at home. I'm sure we all have friends down in Louisiana who are strongly in our prayers as well, who have lost internet access for the last couple of days after Hurricane Ida. This would be great if we had these systems up and running for our own domestic purposes. But I think it's a great way for us to support voices for freedom and people who are struggling for freedom, who should always have the support of the United States. To Lisa's point about the narrative surrounding Iran, one thing I would say is we do know, because they were proud of it and they said it publicly, that in the Obama administration, there was a very active, aggressive campaign to shape the narrative around Iran. The former Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, referred to it as his echo chamber, literally, where they would be pumping information into the mainstream media that would shape the American people's perception of what was happening in Iran. And this is where Lisa and other courageous voices like Mazi Ahmadinejad, who's done heroic work getting videos, and for her work was almost kidnapped by the Iranian regime a couple of months ago. So that's why this is so powerful and so important when we have a US administration that's intent on shaping a different narrative. And one final point I just wanted to make very quickly about Afghanistan is, I am deeply concerned about the message that the nature of the US withdrawal sends to the people of Iran, who I'm sure are seeing a version of that that's being canned by the regime, or filmed, or rather, however you want to put that, manipulated, to make us look as bad, as feckless, and as useless a partner as possible. And I could imagine that would be horribly misleading. So if we have any friends in Iran who are watching this, I would say, please do not assume that is the truth. You have many friends in the United States who want to support you and will work very hard, if we must, through the Congress, to try to get this support to you.
Victoria, thank you so much. I know that does mean so much to Iranians. Interestingly, I think it was the early 2000s, one of the chants, this is before protests became very common in Iran, one of the chants that was shouted in small scale street protests was "Marg bar Taliban, che Kabul, che Tehran," meaning death to the Taliban, whether in Kabul or in Tehran. And so I think that the Iranian people do see a lot of overlap between the Taliban and the Islamic Republic. And in reality, there's not much difference. There's not much daylight between the two. So I think that your point is extremely well taken, and that will certainly be extremely heartwarming to many. My final question of you, Victoria, and you talked about this just at the end. What is your? I don't want to ask you to pull out the non-existent crystal ball. But we see this withdrawal from Afghanistan. We see on the Democratic side, on the Republican side, we also see a growing sense of, if you will, isolationism or a willingness preference to focus more at home, whether correct or incorrect. We see this on both sides of the political aisle, albeit at varying levels and with varying reasons behind it, perhaps. But for those of us who do believe that the United States can play a positive role in the world, and again, I'm not talking about sort of the incorrect way that our position has been described of promoting regime change with war and nation building, but simple things that you're talking about: internet access, sharing these voices, standing for American values. Do you see that still having that ideology, those values still having space in America's major political parties today? And is there hope for those of us who think that America can play a positive role in the world going forward?
Oh, absolutely, Cameron. And I think the critical thing there is to look at the American people's response to what has happened in Afghanistan. I mean, the American people are not a warlike people. They want peace. They want their sons and daughters home. And that's a good thing. That's a positive attribute. And so certainly, people supported the ending of major combat operations in Afghanistan, but not like this. And, the horrified response, to extraordinarily strong majority numbers of the polling I've seen of the American people is saying no, not like this, not with dishonor, not leaving folks behind, including American citizens, and abandoning our interests. And I think people particularly understand, the strategic interest in Afghanistan, particularly around an asset like the Bagram Air Base. That's not something you just walk away from. That's $1 billion in taxpayer money that you're just throwing over to the Taliban, and they don't want that. And so I think if it is clearly explained to the American people, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And no, we are not doing this as disinterested charity. We're doing it to advance our interests. It is in our interests to have a strong democratic partner in Iran. And so, I would just close by thanking you at Nifty for all that you do to work towards that goal. And I think it's important that folks realize that democracy isn't just going to happen out of some kind of evolutionary process. That's a trap we fell into after the end of the Cold War, that all we had to do was wait folks out. And eventually they would want to liberalize because it's what, from our perspective, is the logical thing to do. That's not the case. We know that very clearly from the Chinese example, for example. And so I think being prepared, starting to help build institutions and identify individuals who can assist in this transition and do the planning and the hard work that it's going to take to make that change, I think is enormously important. And so I thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Victoria. And we hope to have, once again, thoughtful, people like yourself in future administrations and those who care for people around the world and America's values. Lisa, one last question to you. You've been covering Iran, the region and national security and foreign policy for a long time. But specifically on Iran, you mentioned the 2009 protests, Twitter revolution, the Green Revolution. You saw the protests in 2016, 17, 18, 19, the videos we're seeing coming out of Iran today. Can you describe for us the change that you've seen over this time period? I mean, what are the changes inside Iran? Are Iranians becoming more vocal, more, I mean, you and I and Victoria, sort of, we see this every day, but for those who don't follow Iran every day, what have been the changes you've seen in the movement inside Iran in the past decade? And again, without asking you to pull out the crystal ball, what do you see going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's been such a really a beautiful evolution to watch from my end. Like I said, when I started, people were so reluctant and so fearful. Even I would do events in Washington or Los Angeles with the expat community. And so many of them would say, don't get me on tape attending a talk, because they would be fearful of their repercussions for their loved ones back in Iran. It sounds far-fetched, but it's true. And I know those who are watching are probably nodding their heads like, oh my God, yes, this is what was happening. But that has changed. A lot of it has changed. The regime has become more brutal, but the people have become more courageous. And that is because there's nothing that a mother who's lost her son or a father who can't put food on the table will not do to fight for their family. You know, people dream of, democracy and liberty and all these lovely, fluffy words, but that doesn't bring them out onto the streets. What brings them out onto the streets is that hunger, it's that pain, it's the brutality against their children that brings them out. And that's exactly what you're seeing. People are so courageous. Social media has helped in getting that message across, but they've become so increasingly courageous. And the reason we know that is because the regime has become, zero tolerance policy on protesters. And that's because they're more fearful of the people than they are of anything else. The Achilles heel of this regime are the 80 million people that have the potential to come out onto the streets, just like the people came out in 1979, but now they are motivated, they are driven to get rid of this regime. And I'll tell you, another thing that has really evolved is that it used to be a Tehran protest. It used to be, the elite, the ones who are in the, I would say, middle or upper socioeconomic brackets. Now, even the hashtag says protests across Iran, to get the message across that we are farmers and we are truckers and we are people who work in the bazaar. We are teachers, we are judges, we are, rich and poor coming together to say no to this regime, no to the IR, which is another popular hashtag as of late. They continue to be the Achilles heel of this regime. And I love Victoria very much, and her perspective so much. That's why I love to have her on my show so often, is because she brings so much optimism. And perhaps that's because of her background in art history, right? Wherever there's a shadow, there's also light. So I'd like to, kind of follow her in her optimism about the region, the future of the people of Iran. And to your point, Cameron, where the people of Iran are looking to, or I think Victoria actually initiated the point to say that the people of Iran may look to Afghanistan, what's going on there, and become disillusioned. By the same token, the people in Afghanistan are looking at the people of Iran and saying, we don't want that to be our history in 40 years. And that will motivate them. And across the region, we're seeing freedom-seeking people come together. I know Victoria wrote about the Cyrus Accords of perhaps something like the Abraham Accords, but between the people of Israel and the people of Iran. Well, you can add the people of Afghanistan, hopefully, to that chain as well. This chain can go across the world, particularly in the Middle East, where the people are so unified against the common enemy, and that enemy being that extremism that is now, instead of shrinking, it's growing, very unfortunately. And we hope to amplify the voices of the people who come out to tell us about their stories.
And you certainly do that every day in your work, and I'm so thankful, especially for both of your optimism. You mentioned, Lisa, the No to the Islamic Republic campaign. One thing that really was sort of, just sent chills down my spine was in the video that we saw of Mr. Lal Mohammadi, who was one of the initiators of that campaign, which started inside the country. He said, every time they flogged me, instead of crying, I shouted no to the Islamic Republic. And I just can't imagine the the sort of the sense of courage that gave other prisoners to hear him being tortured and whipped, but to hear in response not a shriek or a cry, but no to the Islamic Republic. And I think that, as you say, Lisa, that courage and that bravery is something that we're seeing continue to grow across Iran. And I think that the Iranian people, certainly we as Iranian Americans are so appreciative of allies and supporters and friends like the two of you in the field of journalism and in the field of government service. So it was really a pleasure, Lisa Daftari and Victoria Coates, to have the two of you today. Again, we apologize for the change in plan. And as you both said, we continue to express prayers, our best wishes for Mr. Lal Mohammadi. We hope that nothing has happened, but salute him for his ongoing bravery, and we'll continue to keep everyone apprised of that situation. But thank you again, both, for joining us. It was really our pleasure, and we hope to have the honor of having you both back very soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Cameron. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.